Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a corner of the Yuseon Palace that most visitors never see. A long, shadowed hallway where the air smells faintly of polished wood, dried flowers, and the faint musk of silk. You trudge along the stone floor, each step muted, and the sound of distant lanterns swaying above gives the place an almost hypnotic rhythm. Somewhere ahead, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, hints at lives spent perfecting something as deceptively simple as a pillow. The air is calm, almost expectant, as if the room itself knows that sleep is sacred and must be approached with care. You notice small details: the soft scrape of bamboo combs smoothing the hulls, the gentle squeeze of hands shaping the pillow like a potter molding clay, and the faint aroma of herbal treatments mixing with silk. By evening, the embroidery tables are silent, except for the soft scraping of needles and the occasional quiet exhale from a master. You trudge past completed pillows, noticing how each design balances beauty, symbolism, and functionality. Fringe stories suggest that some patterns were intentionally complex, designed to occupy the king's thoughts while drifting into sleep, a gentle mental exercise embedded in silk. Historians still argue whether such psychological intentions were deliberate or romanticized after the fact. Finally, you trudge back from the tables, feeling the subtle weight of history woven into each stitch. Every motif, twist, and flourish represents not only technical skill, but cultural memory, belief, and aesthetic judgment. You probably won't survive the urge to marvel at how these quiet symbols could influence status, comfort, and ritual, all while remaining invisible to the casual observer. The embroidery, like the materials and tools before, becomes an extension of the artisan's hands, mind, and cultural imagination. You trudge toward the heart of the palace, where the royal inspection rituals take place. The artisans carry their freshly crafted pillows, each one gleaming under lantern light, filled to perfection and embroidered with subtle patterns. You probably won't survive the tension in the air if you imagine standing in that corridor, where every misstep could embarrass both apprentice and master. The atmosphere is quiet, heavy with expectation, almost as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. The inspection begins with a subtle ceremony. A palace steward signals for silence, and the king or queen reclines gracefully on a low bed. Fringe anecdotes whisper that some monarchs preferred to test pillows personally, lying down for hours while subtle adjustments were made. Historians still argue whether these sleep trials were formalized rituals or merely occasional exercises born out of curiosity. You trudge alongside an anxious apprentice as they present a pillow. The master holds it aloft, checking its symmetry, the smoothness of silk, and the evenness of the filling. Any small imperfection is noted silently, a gentle nod of disapproval or a minute correction with the hands. Fringe tales suggest that certain kings, famous for their eccentricities, would press the pillow with unusual scrutiny, even tapping it rhythmically to test resilience. Scholars debate whether these actions were strictly for evaluation or subtly playful tests of patience. Patterns and symbols play a role in the inspection too. You notice a crane perfectly centered on a queen's pillow, its wings carefully balanced along the fabric's grain. The embroidery is examined not only for beauty, but for symbolic accuracy. Mistakes could signal poor understanding of social codes. Fringe stories claim that some pillows contain tiny hidden emblems, only visible under moonlight or by touch, a secret message for the monarch alone. Historians still argue whether these esoteric details were widely used or reserved for the most extraordinary commissions. There is a sense of intimacy here, a recognition that every stitch matters, every fold communicates something unspoken, and that these pillows will later cradle the heads of people whose decisions could alter the fate of a kingdom. You trudge your eyes over the fillings next. The buckwheat hulls must be firm yet yielding, the herbs releasing just enough scent to soothe without overwhelming. Masters and apprentices alike watch the monarch's reactions closely. A subtle shift in posture or a quiet exhale can indicate approval or hint at disappointment. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some kings would test a pillow by balancing small objects on it while lying down, observing whether it remained stable. Scholars debate whether this was a genuine quality test or an amusing legend passed down over centuries. Seasonal adjustments influence inspections as well. Winter pillows are denser, sometimes layered with extra cotton or hemp for warmth, while summer cushions are lighter, airy, and infused with cooling herbs. You trudge along as the monarch delicately presses the pillow, testing both texture and temperature. Fringe sources claim that special pillows for midsummer ceremonies were perfumed with rare flowers, adding an olfactory component to the tactile evaluation. Historians still argue whether these scented trials were practical or symbolic. The apprentice's nerves are palpable. You trudge close enough to notice subtle tremors in hands that are otherwise skilled and steady. Each movement, threading a needle, adjusting a seam, is executed with near-religious precision. Fringe stories suggest that minor errors could result in a day of corrective labor or repetition, a silent reminder that excellence is earned. Scholars debate whether these strict practices were routine or exaggerated in retellings to underscore the artisan's devotion. Despite the tension, there is an almost peaceful rhythm to the process. You watch the monarch rise, gently nodding in approval, and the relief that spreads among the workshop is tangible. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some kings personally complimented apprentices in quiet, almost conspiratorial tones, creating lifelong bonds and subtle patronage networks. Historians still argue whether these gestures were common or reserved for exceptional talent. You trudge past a row of completed pillows awaiting the final inspection. Each one seems imbued with the quiet drama of its presentation, the weight of hours of meticulous work, and the hope of approval. Fringe tales claim that some pillows were purposefully tested by being placed under multiple kings in sequence, a trial by royalty. Scholars debate the veracity of these accounts, though the ritualized care is undeniable. Finally, as the inspection concludes, you notice a subtle shift in the room. Tension eases, a quiet satisfaction settles over the artisans, and the lantern glow feels warmer somehow. You probably won't survive the lingering sense of reverence without feeling a curious calm. The pillows now approved are more than objects. They are carriers of devotion, symbolism, and cultural memory, ready to serve their function in both sleep and courtly life. You trudge into the workshop once more, now noticing how the changing seasons subtly influence every aspect of pillow making. Summer heat in Korea can be relentless, and winter nights unforgiving, so fillings, shapes, and firmness must adjust accordingly. You probably won't survive the thought of balancing comfort with climate control over centuries, yet this seasonal dance is central to the craft. In summer, buckwheat hulls are lightly roasted and sifted to reduce moisture, preventing the faint mustiness that can develop in humid air. Silk covers are thinner, allowing ventilation and a cooler surface for the sleeper. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some artisans experimented with adding dried mint leaves or powdered camphor into summer pillows, believing the aroma would induce a gentle cooling effect. A young apprentice accidentally lets a hull slip from her hands, and the sound, though minor, momentarily disrupts the flow. The older master looks up, his expression calm but sharply attentive, and corrects her with a subtle gesture, a reminder that precision is both an art and a discipline. Historians still argue whether these herbal adjustments genuinely affected body temperature or were largely symbolic gestures to appeal to the monarch's sensibilities. Winter, by contrast, requires a denser pillow. Layers of cotton or hemp are incorporated, sometimes sandwiched between buckwheat hulls to provide insulation. Silk coverings are heavier, often quilted, holding warmth close to the neck and shoulders. Fringe sources mention pillows treated with small sachets of warming herbs, like ginger or cinnamon, tucked discreetly within seams. Scholars debate whether such aromatic additions were intended for medicinal benefit, ceremonial effect, or purely for the sensory experience of the royal sleeper. You trudge your hands over a winter pillow and feel the difference immediately. Firm yet yielding, the bulk distributed carefully to maintain head alignment while retaining warmth. The apprentices adjust fillings with near-scientific precision, aware that even slight variation could compromise comfort or disrupt the balance that palace etiquette demanded. Fringe stories claim that masters would perform small, temperature tests, pressing their hands on pillows to gauge how the royal sleeper might perceive them. Historians still argue whether these tests were practical or just ritualized habit. Even the shapes of pillows change with the seasons. Narrower, flatter designs are preferred in the summer for breathability, while winter pillows may be slightly elevated, supporting not only the head but the neck and shoulders against cold drafts. You trudge through a line of apprentices measuring and adjusting each pillow, noticing how subtle differences in height or firmness are calibrated with astonishing precision. Fringe tales suggest that some monarchs would sleep with multiple seasonal pillows, layering them as if to create a microclimate. Scholars debate whether these practices were common or reserved for royalty with peculiar habits. The seasonal adjustments extend to embroidery and symbolic patterns as well. Spring and summer designs favor floral motifs and light, airy imagery, while autumn and winter patterns emphasize pines, cranes, and celestial symbols of endurance. You trudge past a nearly finished pillow, noting how the motif seems to harmonize with the intended season, creating a visual as well as tactile connection to nature. Fringe accounts claim that some designs subtly hinted at upcoming seasonal ceremonies, a quiet reminder of the palace calendar embedded in silk. You trudge beside apprentices as they rotate the materials for inspection, checking for moisture, alignment, and aroma. Buckwheat hulls must remain crisp, silk taut, and herbs balanced. Fringe sources whisper that some masters would rotate pillows on small racks, exposing them to night air to regulate scent and humidity, an almost ritualistic attention to detail. Scholars still argue whether these practices were primarily practical or infused with spiritual intention. You notice that, unlike the grand feasts or dazzling ceremonies of the palace, this workshop thrives on quiet repetition, a kind of understated reverence that historians still argue whether was influenced more by Confucian discipline or sheer obsession with comfort. As you continue, you notice how the seasonal dance affects the workshop itself. The hum of activity varies with the ambient temperature: slower, more deliberate movements in the sweltering summer, brisk yet precise adjustments in the chilly winter air. Apprentices adapt instinctively, guided by the master's subtle cues and decades of accumulated knowledge. Fringe tales suggest that some workshops had secret seasonal formulas, known only to the headmaster, preserving a hidden advantage in texture, scent, and comfort. By evening, you trudge past finished seasonal pillows lined up in a row. Each one is a small masterpiece, calibrated not only for comfort, but for harmony with the climate and symbolism appropriate to the time of year. You probably won't survive the realization that even something as quiet and intimate as a pillow is shaped by environmental, cultural, and aesthetic forces across centuries. Yet here, in this humble workshop, these forces converge into something both practical and profoundly elegant, a subtle art that whispers comfort, status, and care all at once. You trudge beyond the palace walls, following the subtle influence of pillows into Korea's broader culture, where their quiet presence begins to appear in poetry, folk tales, and daily rituals. You probably won't survive the charm of realizing that something as mundane as a pillow could infiltrate imagination. But that's exactly what makes this history so fascinating. The pillow, once reserved for royalty, quietly seeped into the collective consciousness, carrying symbolism, superstition, and whimsy. In classical poetry, pillows are often metaphors for longing, separation, or fleeting dreams. A poet might describe the soft press of silk under a lover's head, or the quiet sigh of a traveler resting after a long journey. Fringe tales suggest that some poets even believed the materials themselves, buckwheat, silk, and herbs, could imbue verses with a meditative quality, helping writers drift into inspiration. Historians still argue whether these poetic references reflect genuine sensory experience or are more figurative, using the pillow as a stand-in for emotion and status. You trudge into the world of folk tales, where pillows take on a playful, sometimes mischievous character. One story tells of a pillow that whispered secrets at night, revealing hidden truths to those who slept upon it. Another legend describes a pillow that could absorb nightmares, a humble guardian of the sleeper's mind. Fringe accounts claim that some households would even speak to pillows before bed, murmuring wishes or confessions into seams. Scholars debate whether these tales were widespread customs or literary embellishments meant to entertain and instruct. Beyond stories, the pillow influenced daily rituals. You trudge past villagers performing simple acts, like placing a freshly fluffed pillow near a window to catch favorable dreams, or sprinkling herbs between folds for a calming scent. Fringe anecdotes insist that some families believed whispering secrets into the pillow ensured they would be safely carried into the dream world. Fringe anecdotes claim that certain master craftsmen could tell the precise mood of a king merely by observing the way he lay on his pillow. Tension in the neck, alignment of the spine, or even a faint twitch of an eyebrow. It is tempting to dismiss these tales as exaggeration, yet as you watch the way the craftsmen handle their materials with such care, it begins to seem plausible that this tiny object, a pillow, could carry more cultural weight than an entire banquet hall. Historians still argue whether these practices were remnants of palace rituals or evolved independently in common households. Even the humble act of gift-giving incorporated pillows. Exchanging a well-made pillow could signify respect, affection, or even subtle social hierarchy. You trudge through imagined scenes of markets and homes, noticing how a carefully embroidered or scented pillow could speak volumes without a single word. Fringe sources claim that in some villages, pillow exchanges were part of matchmaking, a tactile introduction between families. Scholars debate whether this tradition genuinely existed or is a romanticized invention of later folklorists. Artisans outside the palace began to emulate royal designs, adapting embroidery motifs, seasonal fillings, and symbolic patterns for common use. You trudge through a marketplace and see bolts of silk, trays of buckwheat, and small pillows displayed for sale, each carrying echoes of royal craftsmanship. Fringe tales suggest that some clever merchants added whimsical motifs or herbs to attract buyers, claiming subtle magical or therapeutic effects. Historians still argue how closely these adaptations reflected palace originals versus local innovation. Poets, storytellers, and common households all contributed to a sensory vocabulary surrounding pillows. The crunch of hulls, the smooth glide of silk under a cheek, the faint scent of herbs upon awakening. You trudge through these layers of experience, realizing that the pillow becomes a cultural touchstone, a bridge between palace refinement and everyday life. Fringe stories even suggest that some families kept a dream pillow, passed down through generations, carrying faint traces of the past in scent and texture. Scholars debate whether this practice was symbolic, practical, or a blend of both. By evening, you trudge through imagined homes, markets, and poetic landscapes, noticing the pillow's quiet ubiquity. From whispered secrets to artistic inspiration, its influence reaches beyond sleep itself. You probably won't survive the thought that such a simple object could carry layers of social, emotional, and aesthetic meaning across centuries. Yet here it is, humble and persistent, cradling the imagination and dreams of countless Koreans. You trudge into the quieter corners of artisan communities outside the palace, where pillow making takes on a more practical yet still refined form. You probably won't survive the subtle thrill of seeing how palace techniques were adapted for everyday life, but the ingenuity is quietly mesmerizing. In these workshops, materials are less extravagant, but the principles remain: silk or cotton covers, buckwheat hulls, and sometimes a dash of herbs for scent or soothing effect. Apprentices in these neighborhoods follow rhythms reminiscent of the royal workshops, albeit with fewer formal inspections and lighter social pressure. Fringe accounts suggest that some master craftsmen deliberately trained village apprentices in secret, ensuring that certain techniques remained rare or slightly mysterious. Historians still argue whether this secrecy was to preserve quality, maintain social hierarchy, or simply a cultural habit of valuing exclusivity. You start to notice patterns in the motions: a fold here, a tap there, a subtle squeeze that shapes the pillow into a contour that seems both inviting and ceremonially correct. The repetitive rhythm is almost meditative, lulling your senses even as you try to remain alert. There's a faint, sweet scent that wafts from a nearby tray of buckwheat and herbs, and for a moment you wonder if it is intended to influence your mood or simply a byproduct of tradition. You trudge past tables of partially completed pillows, noting how adaptations reflect local needs. Summer cushions are thinner for ventilation, winter designs include extra layers of cotton, and embroidery is simpler but still symbolic. Fringe stories claim that some local designs incorporated playful or humorous motifs, like tiny animals peeking out of clouds, a whimsical contrast to the solemnity of palace symbolism. Scholars debate whether these folk motifs carried any formal meaning or were purely decorative expressions of local creativity. The filling process is just as meticulous as in the palace. Buckwheat hulls are roasted, sifted, and aerated, ensuring even distribution. Herbs like mugwort or dried chrysanthemum petals are sprinkled lightly, creating gentle fragrances. Fringe anecdotes insist that some village artisans believe the scent could influence dreams, encouraging good fortune or emotional balance. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were widespread or the product of isolated folk superstition. You trudge along benches where apprentices work silently, learning through observation and repetition. Their hands move rhythmically, folding, pressing, and stitching as if internalizing centuries of practice. Fringe tales claim that some families preserved signature techniques passed from parent to child, creating regional variations that distinguish their pillows from others in neighboring villages. Scholars debate how much these adaptations influence palace standards versus evolving independently. Even the shapes of village pillows follow functional logic. Narrow, flat cushions for side sleepers, firmer, slightly elevated designs for neck support. You trudge your eyes over patterns, simplified cranes, blossoms, or geometric designs that echo palace aesthetics but remain accessible. Fringe stories suggest that some villagers whispered good wishes into pillows before gifting them, a quiet echo of the palace rituals. Historians still argue whether such customs were inspired directly by court practices or evolved organically within local culture. Markets become a stage for these creations. You trudge through imagined stalls where artisans display rows of finished pillows. Soft colors, gentle fragrances, and carefully balanced fillings entice buyers. Fringe anecdotes claim that certain sellers mark pillows with subtle signs, a kind of artisan signature signaling quality and authenticity. Scholars debate whether these markers were standardized or informal traditions recognized within small communities. Apprentices often exchange tips quietly. You trudge from table to table, noticing subtle differences in technique. A gentler fold here, a tighter stitch there, an innovative use of herbs to extend the pillow's longevity. Fringe accounts claim that some innovations, originally meant for local convenience, were eventually adapted back into palace workshops. Historians still argue whether this reverse flow of knowledge was significant or sporadic. As evening falls, the workshop quiets. Finished pillows are stacked neatly, their fragrances mingling faintly in the air. You trudge past them slowly, noticing how even a simple village pillow carries the imprint of centuries of cultural refinement, ritual, and care. You probably won't survive the subtle realization that comfort, symbolism, and artistry are so deeply intertwined that even everyday objects carry the echo of royalty and tradition. Either way, it adds to the immersive, tactile reality of the place. You trudge into the quieter streets of the village, following the path of pillows as they leave the workshop and enter daily life. You probably won't survive the subtle poetry of observing these humble objects in motion, yet their influence is everywhere, resting on tatami mats, cradling children's heads, or accompanying travelers on long journeys. The pillow has become both practical and cultural, a quiet bridge between artistry and everyday comfort. Children in these villages often play near the workshops, fascinated by the rhythmic tap of hulls being sifted or the shimmer of silk catching the sun. Fringe anecdotes claim that some kids would sneak small scraps of embroidered silk to fashion their own mini pillows, mimicking royal luxury in miniature form. Historians still argue whether these playful creations contributed meaningfully to local craft traditions or were simply transient amusements. You trudge alongside villagers preparing for seasonal festivals. Special pillows are displayed in homes or offered as gifts, often filled with fragrant herbs meant to encourage good fortune or protect sleepers from nightmares. Fringe sources suggest that families would whisper wishes or secrets into pillow seams during ceremonies, a private ritual linking domestic life to the broader rhythms of society. Scholars debate whether these customs were widespread or limited to certain regions and social classes. Even in marketplaces, pillows carry symbolic weight. You trudge past stalls where merchants display embroidered cushions, each labeled with subtle signs of quality, origin, or artisan identity. Fringe stories claim that some families would travel great distances to acquire a particular master's pillow, believing it would bring superior sleep, enhanced dreams, or even social prestige. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were deeply rooted in local culture or amplified by folklore and anecdote. Travelers, too, relied on portable versions of royal-inspired pillows. You trudge alongside merchants and wandering scholars, watching them carry small, firm cushions designed to protect the neck during long rides. Fringe accounts suggest that some travelers added local herbs or small charms, believing that these adaptations provided spiritual as well as physical comfort. Scholars debate whether these practices were widespread or isolated to particularly superstitious regions. The pillow's influence extends even into poetry and art outside the palace. You trudge through imagined gatherings of literati where silk cushions cradle heads during contemplative afternoons, offering both physical support and a quiet canvas for inspiration. Fringe anecdotes claim that some poets would press small symbols into pillows with their fingertips before writing, believing the texture would influence the rhythm of their verse. Historians still argue whether such tactile interactions genuinely affected literary production or are imaginative embellishments. Social interactions also revolve around pillows. You trudge past homes where gift-giving or matchmaking incorporates these cushions, signaling respect, affection, or status without words. Fringe stories suggest that some families would embroider initials, hidden symbols, or playful motifs, creating a private language embedded in silk. Scholars debate whether these practices were functional or simply decorative gestures meant to impress outsiders. The room is quiet enough that your own breathing seems loud. You trudge carefully between benches, aware that your presence is an intrusion in a ritual older than most stories you've ever heard. Some scholars still argue whether these workshops were truly open to outsiders at all, or if they operated under a strict veil of secrecy, with apprentices forbidden from speaking to anyone outside the craft. Apprentices who moved from palace workshops to village craft often carried subtle stylistic hallmarks. You trudge through a cluster of homes where these artisans produce pillows reflecting royal lineage, embroidery motifs, carefully measured fillings, and precise stitching techniques. Fringe accounts insist that these artisans sometimes added whimsical flourishes, bridging the gap between solemn court tradition and lively folk creativity. Historians still argue whether such innovations significantly influence palace standards or remain purely local variations. Even as the day ends, the pillow's presence is felt in both mundane and ceremonial contexts. You trudge past windows where families arrange cushions for evening rest, noting how comfort, symbolism, and sensory experience merge seamlessly. Fringe anecdotes claim that some households believe pillows could absorb dreams, a quiet domestic echo of palace ritual. Scholars debate whether these beliefs had empirical, symbolic, or purely imaginative foundations. By nightfall, you trudge back along the dimly lit streets, sensing how the pillow quietly mediates life, sleep, and social meaning. You probably won't survive the subtle realization that such an ordinary object carries centuries of history, artistry, and cultural memory. Yet here it lies, humble and enduring, cradling heads and carrying dreams across generations. You trudge into the domestic spaces of Korea, where pillows have quietly become indispensable, yet their presence is often unnoticed, like a soft whisper in the daily rhythm of life. You probably won't survive the realization that the royal craft traditions have seeped into the humblest homes, shaping comfort, routine, and ritual. But it's astonishing to see how pervasive their influence has become. Even in simple houses, silk covers may be replaced with cotton or hemp, but the attention to filling remains. Buckwheat hulls are roasted, sifted, and aerated to achieve optimal softness and resilience. Fringe accounts suggest that families occasionally added a pinch of herbs, like chrysanthemum or mugwort, believing that their subtle aroma promoted good dreams. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in empirical experience or transmitted as folklore. You trudge past a mother preparing pillows for her children. Each cushion is fluffed, folded, and lightly scented, a quiet act of care that mirrors the meticulousness of palace artisans. Fringe stories claim that some mothers would whisper blessings into the pillows before bedtime, echoing palace rituals on a domestic scale. Scholars debate whether these acts were widely practiced or limited to families with cultural or regional inclination toward traditional craft. The daily routines around pillows reveal surprising discipline. You trudge alongside household members as they rotate, air, or sun their cushions, preserving both hygiene and scent. Fringe anecdotes insist that some households had miniature seasonal adjustments, thinner fillings for summer, extra layers for winter. Historians still argue whether these adaptations were practical responses to climate or influenced by palace tradition. Even in ordinary social interactions, pillows convey subtle meaning. You trudge through imagined village gatherings, where presenting a finely embroidered cushion signals respect, friendship, or familial devotion. Fringe accounts suggest that hidden motifs or personal touches, like initials or secret patterns, were used to communicate private messages silently. Scholars debate whether these embedded codes were functional or purely decorative. Artisans who had trained in palace workshops often returned home, spreading their knowledge quietly. You trudge past small workshops tucked into alleys, where apprentices replicate refined techniques, yet adapt them to local tastes and resources. Fringe tales insist that some local variations were whimsical, playful, or even mischievous, contrasting with the solemnity of court designs. The latter seems likely, given the hushed tones and subtle glances that ripple across the room as you move. Historians still argue whether these adaptations influence palace aesthetics in return or remain strictly regional. The pillow also mediates daily comfort in surprising ways. You trudge into bedrooms where families align cushions for proper neck support, layering them for extra warmth or airflow depending on season and preference. Fringe anecdotes claim that some households would position pillows according to feng shui principles or symbolic alignment, suggesting that sleep was considered a subtly spiritual experience. Scholars debate how much such practices were ritualized versus improvised. Even the act of gift-giving reflects the pillow's cultural weight. You trudge through imagined exchanges during festivals, weddings, or ceremonial visits, where a carefully crafted pillow communicates attention, care, and cultural literacy without uttering a word. Fringe stories suggest that some pillow gifts incorporated miniature charms, inscriptions, or hidden symbols, enhancing their perceived value and significance. Historians still argue whether these practices were standardized or ad hoc gestures of affection and respect. As night deepens, you trudge past the quiet homes, sensing the pillow's influence in both form and ritual. It's more than a support for the head. It is a vessel of comfort, care, artistry, and cultural memory, subtly reinforcing social bonds and domestic routines. You probably won't survive the thought that such a simple object carries layers of history, yet here it lies, silent but essential, linking palace, village, and home across centuries. You trudge into the late-night quiet of the villages, where the influence of pillows stretches into health, superstition, and subtle domestic science. You probably won't survive the realization that the humble pillow was once considered a tool not just for comfort, but for regulating body, mind, and even spirit. But here it is, resting quietly on mats and beds, shaping lives in ways both practical and mystical. Herbs tucked into pillows were not mere fragrance. They were believed to have physiological benefits. Mugwort, for example, was thought to calm nerves, aid circulation, and even ward off minor ailments. Fringe accounts insist that some families experimented with combinations of dried herbs to treat insomnia, cold symptoms, or fatigue. Historians still argue whether these effects were empirically valid or largely psychological, transmitted as cultural wisdom through generations. You trudge past small household workshops where pillows are made or adjusted with care. Each pillow is inspected, fluffed, and sometimes tested by pressing with the hand or gently shaking to gauge resilience. Fringe tales claim that certain families believed a pillow could detect illness. If it felt unusually soft or heavy, it was a sign to consult a healer. Scholars debate whether such beliefs were widespread or anecdotal, folklore amplified over time. Even in matters of superstition, pillows held symbolic weight. You trudge along rooms where small charms, coins, tiny talismans, or embroidered symbols were hidden in seams to ensure safety and prosperity during sleep. Fringe stories insist that some households whispered blessings into pillows, echoing palace rituals in miniature, embedding intention into daily life. Historians still argue whether these practices had any functional basis or were purely psychological reassurance. Travelers relied on pillows for more than comfort. You trudge alongside merchants, scholars, and wandering monks, each carrying portable cushions, often layered with herbs or small charms. Fringe accounts suggest that some believe these portable pillows could preserve dreams, protect against misfortune, or even serve as conduits for spiritual focus during meditation. Scholars debate whether these practices were ritualized or anecdotal adaptations of palace traditions. One of the masters leans over a nearly finished pillow, pressing gently to check its firmness. You realize that the balance between softness and support is not arbitrary. It is scientifically considered, at least by the standards of the time, and yet the methodology is largely undocumented. Fringe accounts suggest that some fillings were chosen according to seasonal astrological charts, a curious intersection of comfort, superstition, and ceremonial precision. Education and apprenticeship continued the pillow's cultural transmission. You trudge through small workshops where young artisans learn to prepare fillings, embroider symbols, and measure precisely. Fringe tales whisper that some masters taught pupils secret methods, preserving subtle skills across generations. Historians still argue whether these techniques were widespread, ceremonial, or tightly guarded family secrets. The pillow also influenced social norms and etiquette. You trudge past imagined homes where presenting a pillow or arranging cushions signaled attention to guests, deference to elders, or care within families. Fringe anecdotes suggest that improper positioning or using a lower quality pillow could communicate subtle disrespect, highlighting how deeply embedded these objects were in social life. Scholars debate whether such conventions were codified or evolved naturally over time. Even the smallest children were introduced to these traditions. You trudge past scenes of infants resting on carefully prepared pillows, often with simple embroidery or soft herbs tucked inside. Fringe stories claim that early exposure to these textures and scents was thought to influence health, sleep quality, and even character development. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were widespread child-rearing practices or isolated localized customs. As you trudge into the deeper night, you notice that the pillow serves multiple overlapping roles: functional support, aesthetic object, medicinal device, social communicator, and spiritual instrument. You probably won't survive the realization that an object so quiet, so ordinary, could hold such multifaceted significance. But the evidence is here, in every home, workshop, and marketplace, silently shaping Korean life across centuries. You trudge into the final corridors of the artisan's world, where the culmination of years of craft, ritual, and subtle innovation comes together in finished masterpieces. You probably won't survive the awe of seeing centuries of quiet devotion manifested in a single pillow. Yet here they lie, ready to cradle heads, dreams, and cultural memory alike. The workshop is calm now, lanterns casting soft glows over stacks of meticulously embroidered and perfectly filled cushions. Each pillow is a testament to accumulated knowledge. Buckwheat hulls sifted and aerated just so, herbs carefully proportioned, silk tensioned perfectly. These elements converge to create comfort, stability, and subtle fragrance. Fringe accounts suggest that some artisans whispered blessings into pillows at the moment of completion, a secret charm left behind for whoever would rest upon them. Historians still argue whether these acts were common practice or anecdotal embellishments intended to romanticize the craft. You trudge along rows of pillows awaiting delivery to the royal court or local households. The seasonal adjustments are evident: lighter summer cushions with airy silk, denser winter versions layered for warmth, each embroidered motif reflecting aesthetic, symbolic, and sometimes spiritual intention. Fringe tales insist that certain master artisans reserve subtle secret touches, like hidden symbols or minute variations, meant only for the most discerning patrons. Scholars debate whether these signatures were purely artistic or part of an invisible social hierarchy. Even the quiet rituals surrounding delivery reinforce the pillow's cultural importance. Couriers and attendants carefully transport them, often in protective wrappings, preserving scent, shape, and symbolic alignment. You trudge alongside these porters, noticing the reverence in their movements, a subtle echo of the deference paid within the workshops themselves. You probably won't survive this if you expect drama or sword fights. Here, the peril is in monotony, in the tiny heartbreaks of thread and husk, and the obsessive pursuit of perfection. Historians still argue whether these practices had any measurable effect on sleep quality or were purely symbolic gestures toward royal favor. Fringe stories claim that some deliveries included whispered instructions or blessings to maintain the pillow's intended effect, though historians still argue whether such practices were formalized or sporadic. You trudge past final inspections, where apprentices, masters, and occasionally visiting nobles examine every stitch, fold, and scent. Even minor imperfections are corrected, emphasizing precision and devotion. Fringe accounts suggest that some pillows were tested with delicate pressure or scent sampling to ensure quality, a practice reminiscent of palace trials. Scholars debate whether these assessments were ritualized or purely practical evaluations. Artisans often leave subtle marks or signatures, almost invisible to the casual eye. You trudge your fingers along a seam, tracing an almost imperceptible swirl or knot, a quiet claim of craftsmanship. Fringe tales suggest that such subtle markings were intended to communicate lineage, skill, or even secret messages to other artisans or patrons. Historians still argue whether these marks were symbolic, practical, or purely ceremonial. Finally, you trudge away from the workshop, leaving the pillows to their intended purposes: comfort, ritual, art, and symbolism, all folded into one. You probably won't survive the quiet realization that these humble objects carry centuries of human intention, devotion, and cultural memory. Even in their silence, they speak to patience, precision, and the enduring connection between artisan and sleeper, tradition and daily life. You trudge into the final quiet of the day, where the weight of centuries seems to settle softly around you. You probably won't survive the slow, mesmerizing realization that every pillow you've seen, from palace masterpieces to village cushions, carries layers of human care, artistry, and cultural memory. Here, in the fading glow of lanterns, the craft feels almost alive, each stitch and hull a quiet heartbeat. The apprentices now move with calm precision, reflecting years of repeated training, observation, and subtle guidance from masters. Fringe accounts whisper that some could produce a flawless pillow in near silence, their hands moving almost autonomously, guided by muscle memory and deep knowledge. Historians still argue whether these feats were widespread among the most skilled or exceptional, rare demonstrations of devotion. You trudge past the final line of completed pillows, noting the delicate balance between functionality and artistry. Embroidery motifs, textures, and fillings all converge to serve both the physical comfort of the sleeper and the symbolic needs of the society they inhabit. Fringe stories insist that some pillows contained hidden charms or miniature messages sewn into seams, personalizing the object in ways invisible to outsiders. Scholars debate whether these were standard practice or the eccentricities of particularly devoted masters. Even the mundane aspects, the rotation of pillows for airing, slight adjustments in filling, seasonal modifications, reveal a disciplined, ritualized approach to everyday life. You trudge alongside artisans, checking each cushion, imagining how subtle changes could influence comfort, dream quality, and even social signals. Fringe anecdotes suggest that certain families outside the palace continued these practices for generations, preserving a quiet echo of royal attention. Historians still argue whether these practices were direct extensions of palace craft or independent folk adaptations. As the evening deepens, the lantern's golden glow softens, shadows stretching along the walls. You trudge along the rows of artisans, noticing the meticulous care even in corners invisible to the casual observer. Every edge is smoothed, every seam tightened, and every pillow seems to carry the quiet intensity of years of training. It's almost impossible to imagine that something so small, something as overlooked as a pillow, could contain such devotion, artistry, and cultural significance. The pillow's role in culture, from poetry to gift-giving, continues to resonate. You trudge through imagined homes and workshops, noting how a simple cushion communicates respect, care, and social sophistication without a single word. Fringe stories suggest that some households treated pillows as repositories of familial intention or blessings, whispering hopes into seams as if embedding love into fabric. Scholars debate whether such rituals were symbolic, practical, or a mixture of both. You trudge past the ambient sounds of evening, the soft sigh of silk, the faint rustle of hulls settling, the distant clink of a tool set down. Each sensory detail reflects centuries of refinement, the quiet devotion of artisans, and the enduring significance of something so ostensibly simple. Fringe accounts claim that some pillows were even thought to influence dreams, health, or spiritual balance, blending functionality and belief into a single object. Historians still argue how widespread these perceptions truly were. Finally, you trudge back through the dim corridors, absorbing the subtle serenity of the workshop, the village, and the palace itself. You probably won't survive the lingering sense of awe at how such a small object can carry so much meaning, connecting hands, heads, and hearts across generations. The pillow has become more than a tool for sleep. It is a vessel of history, culture, artistry, and quiet devotion, waiting patiently for the next head to rest upon it. By the time you step back, the faintest smile tugs at your lips. You've witnessed a slow, deliberate world where silence is a companion and touch is a language. You realize that these pillows are more than objects. They are the crystallization of centuries of sensory knowledge, painstaking repetition, and cultural reverence, patiently waiting to cradle the heads of royalty. And now, through your imagination, yours too. You trudge deeper into the history of the royal pillow, imagining the moment it first entered the gilded halls of the Joseon dynasty. Picture yourself walking alongside a young court official, carrying a simple rectangular bundle of silk and buckwheat husks, unaware that this unassuming object will eventually become a symbol of prestige and refined taste. It's fascinating. Most people assume pillows are just pillows, but in Joseon Korea, they were almost talismanic. You probably won't survive the next few centuries if you try to trace every twist and tangle of this story without your eyelids drooping. The origins of the royal pillow are murky, and historians still argue whether they evolved directly from imported Chinese designs or emerged as a distinct Korean craft. Some evidence suggests that early court pillows were basic wooden boards, sometimes cushioned with straw, intended more for posture than comfort. Yet over decades, these humble beginnings transformed into elaborate silk-covered cushions, carefully filled with aromatic herbs or buckwheat hulls. Fringe sources whisper of pillows crafted with hidden compartments to store miniature charms or even secret love notes, a fact that adds a whisper of intrigue to otherwise serene craftsmanship. You wander through an imagined palace corridor where courtiers carry these cushions like small works of art, each embroidered with symbolic motifs: phoenixes for prosperity, cranes for longevity, and clouds for the fleeting nature of dreams. These patterns were not mere decoration. They broadcast the owner's taste, wealth, and adherence to Confucian propriety. One scholar still argues whether the symbolic motifs actually influenced sleep quality or were simply visual affirmations of status. In the quieter corners of the palace, you catch glimpses of artisans testing new fillings. Buckwheat hulls, although dense and supportive, produce a subtle crunch under movement. Some experimented with finely chopped herbs like mugwort and ginseng, which gave off faint scents claimed to promote relaxation or ward off nightmares. You lean in, imagining inhaling the aroma yourself. It is earthy, slightly sweet, almost hypnotic. Fringe accounts claim a few court artisans swore by filling pillows with rare substances such as powdered deer antler, though historians debate whether this was real or simply part of palace legend making. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to imagine where in the world someone is lying down right now listening to the quiet history of Korean royal pillows. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the sleeping quarters, noting how even the shape of the pillow mattered. Some were long and narrow for side sleepers, while others were firm rectangles to support the neck in exact alignment with rigid wooden bed frames. It's almost comical to picture royalty fretting over neck angles, but in this culture, a pillow could subtly communicate rank and etiquette. You probably won't survive the shock of learning that a misaligned pillow might provoke royal displeasure, or worse, a stern lecture from the head steward. Historians still argue whether the court prioritized aesthetics over functionality, or if comfort and ceremony were carefully balanced. There's evidence that some kings preferred pillows so firm they might double as footrests or even low stools, while queens and concubines favored softer, more yielding surfaces. You imagine the apprentices nervously observing which way the ruler's head tilted, adjusting fillings with almost ritual precision. The fringe stories are equally fascinating. One claims a certain Joseon king demanded that each pillow be blessed by reciting a short poem before it was sewn shut, as a talisman against bad dreams. Others suggest that special pillows were crafted for certain ceremonies, like coronations or seasonal rituals, and were never meant to be slept upon at all. You trudge along these tales with a mix of skepticism and wonder, appreciating how even small objects can carry layers of culture, superstition, and social signaling. As you stroll through these corridors in your mind, you notice the subtle evolution of technique. Early wooden boards gradually gave way to padded surfaces with buckwheat hulls carefully roasted to reduce moisture, silk coverings dyed in court-approved colors, and delicate embroidery designed to avoid both wear and offense. Every change reflected both technological innovation and shifting tastes at court. Fringe historians argue that the evolution was also influenced by imported fabrics and tools from China and even Japan, though local artisans adapted them into a distinct Korean style that persists in echoes today. You watch the imagined artisans bend over their workbenches, their fingers deftly folding silk over fillings. Some pillows feature hidden layers of hemp for firmness, others include scented sachets for gentle aromatherapy. You can almost hear whispers about whose pillow lasted longest or whose design impressed the queen. Small competitions that infused even this quiet craft with a dash of human rivalry. Scholars still debate whether these contests influenced broader design trends or remained isolated within palace walls. By the time evening settles over the imagined palace, you begin to understand that the pillow was more than a sleeping aid. It was a symbol of refinement, an emblem of hierarchy, and a canvas for cultural expression. Even today, when you rest your head on a simple pillow, you are, in some small way, part of this centuries-long dialogue between comfort, art, and social signaling. The workshop stretches before you, a narrow room partitioned by hanging silk screens that sway with the softest draft. Lanterns cast golden pools on the floor, illuminating artisans who crouch or kneel over low tables. Their hands move in coordinated precision, folding silk over buckwheat hulls, tapping, compressing, and smoothing until the pillow takes shape. You probably won't survive the temptation to marvel at how something so mundane could carry such quiet power. But that's the beauty of history. The smallest objects often tell the largest stories. You trudge into the workshop once more, this time paying closer attention to the materials spread across the low tables. Buckwheat hulls spill from woven baskets, silk bolts glimmer under lantern light, and faint wisps of aromatic herbs curl lazily in the air. You probably won't survive this if you start sneezing from all the subtle fragrances. But that's part of the charm, isn't it? The materials themselves are a lesson in sensory history, teaching patience, attention to detail, and the quiet joy of transformation. Buckwheat hulls were the backbone of the royal pillow. Dense, lightweight, and surprisingly resilient, they conformed to the contours of the neck while maintaining firmness. Artisans would roast the hulls lightly to reduce moisture, preventing the faint, musty odor that could otherwise ruin the pillow's delicate aura. Some fringe accounts suggest that certain masters added tiny crushed pearls to the hulls, claiming that it improved circulation while sleeping, a curious combination of practicality and superstition. Historians still argue whether these exotic additions were widespread or simply the eccentricities of a few particularly inventive craftsmen. Silk, of course, was another critical element. You trudge your fingers across a bolt of shimmering fabric and feel the almost magical smoothness under your fingertips. Silk coverings were not just luxurious, they protected the delicate filling and allowed for fine embroidery, which itself conveyed symbolic meaning. The colors chosen were dictated by court protocol, muted pastels for certain seasons, bold reds and blues for festivals. Fringe sources whisper that some artisans experimented with scented silks, dipping threads in herbal solutions to release calming aromas when the pillow was hugged or pressed. Tiny sensory rituals embedded in daily life. And then there were the herbs, mugwort, ginseng, and sometimes lesser-known plants whose fragrances were believed to promote restfulness and ward off bad dreams. You lean closer, catching the faint, earthy aroma that mingles with silk and wood. Apprentices would crush the herbs finely, almost ritualistically, and sprinkle them between the buckwheat layers. Scholars still argue whether these herbal fillings had any measurable impact on sleep quality, or if their benefits were largely psychological, a product of belief and ceremony. You trudge over to examine some of the more unusual fillings. Some fringe sources mention tiny amounts of finely powdered deer antler or even rice husks soaked in fermented liquids. Ingredients that sound bizarre today, but were thought to enhance durability or scent. You notice the meticulous care with which these ingredients are blended, ensuring that no lump or stray particle disturbs the pillow's balance. The very act of preparing the filling was almost meditative, each movement calibrated and precise. The rhythmic motion is almost hypnotic, and you notice that even the faintest noise, a dropped needle, a misaligned stitch, elicits a soft collective sigh. One of the older craftsmen hums a tune as he works, a melody so gentle it seems to encourage the silk to cooperate. The tactile experience is fascinating. You pick up a finished pillow and feel the way buckwheat hulls shift under gentle pressure, yielding just enough to cradle the neck while maintaining firm support. The silk surface feels cool and smooth, subtly fragranced by the herbs within. Fringe anecdotes claim that some royal pillows contained hidden layers of aromatic moss or camphor, meant to keep night insects at bay, a practical solution wrapped in a ritualistic, almost poetic layer. Historians still argue whether such embellishments were common practice or isolated quirks of eccentric masters. You trudge through the sensory landscape of materials and notice a curious paradox. Something so simple as buckwheat or silk could embody centuries of knowledge, experimentation, and cultural refinement. A pile of hulls is more than filler. It is the tactile expression of a tradition, each husk chosen, roasted, and sorted with care. Even the smallest mistake, a damp hull, a frayed thread, could undermine hours of work, making the process a delicate balance between craft and devotion. There is a subtle hierarchy among materials too. Rare silks reserved for queens or high-ranking officials are soft enough to almost melt under your fingertips, while sturdier, darker silks might be used for princes or princes-in-waiting. The fillings also varied: buckwheat for firmness, herbs for scent, and sometimes a layer of cotton or hemp to adjust softness. You can almost hear the quiet debates among apprentices. Too much ginseng and the pillow is stiff, too little and the aroma fades. Shueti. Fringe stories even suggest that some masters performed taste tests on the buckwheat hulls, not to eat them, of course, but to ensure the roasting had released the perfect earthy fragrance. As evening deepens, the lantern glow reveals the subtle shimmer of silk threads and the muted sheen of polished wood. You trudge from bench to bench, feeling the almost imperceptible differences between pillows crafted by various masters. Some are firm and structured, others pliable yet supportive. Each reflects not only the material, but the hand that crafted it. Historians still argue whether certain combinations of silk, hull, and herbs were formulaic or left to the artisan's intuition. Finally, you trudge back to the central table and observe a completed pillow, smooth, fragrant, and perfectly balanced. You realize that these materials, buckwheat, silk, herbs, carry a quiet weight far beyond their physical presence. They embody centuries of experimentation, ritual, and aesthetic judgment, proving that even the simplest items can hold the deepest cultural resonance. And as you imagine a king resting his head on such a pillow, inhaling the subtle herbal scent, it's easy to see why comfort, artistry, and prestige became inseparable in the world of Korea's royal craftsmen. You trudge closer to the corner of the workshop where the tools lie in patient silence, neatly arranged on soft cloths or in shallow wooden trays. Needles of various lengths, bamboo combs, wooden molds, and tiny spoons for herbal fillings are laid out like a miniature museum of pillow-making technology. You probably won't survive the urge to poke at everything, but resist. Even a light misstep could ruin days of careful work. Each implement has a story, a function, and sometimes a ceremonial importance that blurs the line between practicality and tradition. The needles are delicate yet strong, often hand-forged by specialized artisans outside the palace. They vary in thickness depending on the silk thread or embroidery required. Fringe tales insist that some masters carried a secret needle reserved for royal pillows, allegedly sharper and smoother than ordinary ones, able to pierce silk without leaving even the tiniest snag. Historians still argue whether the Joseon dynasty deliberately cultivated this quiet craft as a form of meditative discipline for artisans, or if it simply arose from practical demands of comfort and courtly opulence. Either way, it is fascinating to see how something as mundane as a pillow became entwined with royal life. Fringe tales whisper that some craftsmen claim to infuse pillows with faint herbal scents to calm royal nightmares. Lavender, mugwort, or even finely powdered ginseng. Historians still argue whether these needles were truly exceptional or simply a ritualized object of mystique, enhancing the perceived value of the final product. You trudge your fingers across wooden molds shaped to guide the pillow's structure, noticing subtle carvings that indicate exact dimensions. These molds ensure that pillows maintain a consistent height and firmness, reflecting a meticulous attention to ergonomic precision long before modern science. Fringe anecdotes suggest that some molds were treated with herbal oils to subtly scent the filling while shaping it, a curious fusion of form, function, and olfactory ritual. Scholars still debate whether these molds were standardized across the kingdom or varied from workshop to workshop based on the master's preferences. Bamboo combs sit beside trays of buckwheat hulls and herbs. Their purpose is deceptively simple: to aerate the hulls, remove dust, and align fibers. But you quickly see the skill involved. The apprentice moves with gentle rhythmic sweeps, ensuring that the filling remains uniform and supple. Fringe reports claim that some combs were inscribed with tiny talismanic symbols, meant to impart calm to the sleeping royal. Historians still argue whether these marks were purely decorative or considered functional, part of the spiritual dimension of sleep. Other implements include tiny spoons for precisely measured herbal fillings. Mugwort, ginseng, camphor, and even lesser-known plants are portioned with surgical accuracy. You trudge closer and notice that some herbs are crushed into powders so fine they almost float in the air, creating a subtle haze that lingers above the workbench. Fringe sources claim that the scent alone was enough to influence dreams, while scholars debate whether these aromatic rituals had any measurable effect or were mainly ceremonial. You trudge past a section reserved for embroidery tools, hoops, needles, and silk threads of every imaginable color. Each hoop maintains tension on the delicate silk covering, allowing intricate patterns to form without puckering. Fringe stories suggest that apprentices who misaligned their embroidery were made to sit overnight in silence as a subtle form of discipline. Historians still argue whether such strict methods were common practice or exaggerated by later storytellers seeking dramatic flair. Small wooden presses are also used to flatten and shape pillows after filling. You trudge your hands along a newly pressed cushion, feeling the subtle firmness and smoothness that results from careful compression. Fringe anecdotes claim some presses were carved with hidden compartments for charms, intended to imbue the pillow with good fortune. Scholars debate whether these were genuine rituals or symbolic gestures to impress royal patrons. You watch a young apprentice sprinkle a barely visible powder into a pillowcase, nodding with the reverence usually reserved for holy texts. Even the most mundane tools are treated with care. Brushes for dusting off loose hulls, small trays to catch stray threads, and bowls for soaking silk in herbal solutions all contribute to a precise, almost meditative workflow. You trudge from station to station, noticing the quiet choreography. Each implement is not just a tool, but an extension of the artisan's hands, shaping comfort and status simultaneously. You watch an apprentice gently pierce a silk cover with a needle, thread it and pull tight, then repeat the motion dozens of times. The rhythm is hypnotic, and you realize that the tools themselves dictate the pace of work, guiding motions almost as much as the hands wielding them. Fringe accounts claim that certain tools, when handled incorrectly, could curse a pillow, causing the user to have restless sleep, a superstition that underscores how seriously the artisans approach their craft. Historians still argue whether the combination of these tools, materials, and techniques represents early ergonomics, ritualistic practice, or simply aesthetic obsession. As you trudge back and glance over the workshop, you notice how seamlessly every implement integrates with the process. The needles, molds, combs, and spoons all work together, shaping the humble pillow into an object worthy of royalty, yet quiet and unassuming enough to cradle a king's head while he dreams. By the end of your imagined walkthrough, it becomes clear that tools are not just aids. They are partners in a centuries-old dialogue between comfort, art, and ritual. Even in their silence, they convey expertise, devotion, and the subtle weight of cultural expectation, preparing the way for the next stage of this meditative craft. You trudge alongside the apprentices now, observing their daily grind with a mixture of admiration and mild disbelief. Their movements are repetitive, almost hypnotic. Each fold of silk, each tap of buckwheat hulls, repeated dozens of times before it is deemed satisfactory. You probably won't survive the monotony if you imagine doing this for years, yet there is a strange serenity in their focus, a quiet pride that seems to grow with each perfectly stitched pillow. The apprentice day begins before dawn, long before the palace stirs. You trudge along narrow corridors of the workshop where lanterns cast soft pools of golden light on low tables. The air smells faintly of silk and roasted hulls, comforting yet slightly intoxicating over time. Each apprentice checks their tools meticulously, needles aligned by size, molds placed in exact positions, trays of herbs measured to the fraction of a teaspoon. Fringe tales suggest that some masters even tested the apprentices' tactile sensitivity by blindfolding them, letting them sort hulls or thread needles purely by touch. Historians still argue whether this was widespread training or an occasional eccentric practice. You trudge beside a young apprentice, watching her methodically fold a silk square over a bed of buckwheat. Every movement is deliberate. The silk is smoothed, the filling compressed, the corners tucked with precision. There's a rhythm, almost musical in its repetition, punctuated by the faint scratching of needles and the occasional sigh from a master passing by. Fringe anecdotes claim that some apprentices whispered short prayers or poems into the pillow before stitching it closed, believing it would imbue the object with calm or good fortune. Scholars debate whether these rituals influenced sleep quality or were merely symbolic gestures. The monotony is balanced by tiny lessons in craftsmanship. Each day, apprentices learn to distinguish subtle differences in material texture. Buckwheat hulls that are too dry, silk that is too coarse, or herbs that are slightly too fragrant. You trudge along, noticing how each adjustment affects the pillow's final shape, firmness, and aroma. Even the lightest misstep, a seam slightly off, a fold uneven, can transform a pillow from acceptable to unacceptable in the eyes of the masters. You trudge closer to a workbench and notice the assortment of fillings laid out like a miniature buffet, tiny buckwheat hulls that crunch softly between fingers, wisps of cotton, and bundles of hair-like fibers from unknown plants. One particularly curious pillow seems to shimmer slightly under the lantern light, and you are told in hushed tones that it was woven with threads soaked in fermented rice water, a technique said to extend silk longevity. Fringe stories claim that some errors led to apprentices repeating the same pillow dozens of times, a test of patience and precision. Breaks are quiet and brief. Apprentices sit on wooden benches, occasionally sipping lightly sweetened tea or nibbling rice cakes. The room hums with soft conversation, though it is almost ceremonial in its restraint. You trudge through this lull in activity and notice how apprentices share tips quietly. A subtle twist of the wrist, a gentler tap of the hulls, a softer tension in threading needles. Historians still argue whether these informal lessons shape the craft more than formal instruction from the masters. As the day progresses, you watch the apprentice's skills sharpen. Hands move almost instinctively now, folding, pressing, and stitching with a flow that borders on choreography. Fringe accounts suggest that some apprentices could produce dozens of pillows in a single day without error, a feat that seems impossible yet is whispered about in hushed admiration. Scholars debate whether such productivity was standard or exaggerated to impress outsiders or visiting officials. You notice the apprentices often pause to inspect their work, comparing it against a standard or the master's example. The process is meticulous, repetitive, and painstakingly slow, but each pillow reflects both individual skill and the traditions of a centuries-old craft. Fringe tales tell of apprentices who fell asleep at their benches yet still produced flawless pillows, a testament to muscle memory or perhaps magical devotion. There's also a subtle psychological component. The apprentices learn patience, focus, and humility. You trudge along these mental pathways as much as the physical ones, imagining how repetition teaches resilience. A misaligned stitch becomes a lesson, a crushed hull, a gentle reprimand from the hands of time. Historians still argue whether this discipline was intended purely for craftsmanship or served as a broader moral education in Confucian values. By evening, you see the transformation. Young apprentices who arrived groggy and hesitant now move with quiet confidence. Each pillow on the bench is nearly perfect, a testament to hours of repetitive care. Fringe accounts say that some apprentices whispered their own dreams into the seams, a private ritual carried into the royal bedrooms, though scholars debate whether this was common or merely romanticized. Finally, as lanterns dim and the workshop quiets, you realize the daily grind is less about drudgery and more about devotion. Every stitch, every fold, every tap of hulls reflects a meditation in motion, a practice of patience, and a commitment to perfection. You probably won't survive the temptation to marvel at this devotion without feeling a strange calm wash over you, a shared sleepiness between artisan, material, and observer. You trudge closer to the embroidery tables, where delicate patterns begin to emerge on the silk surfaces of royal pillows. Threads of gold, silver, and pastel silk shimmer faintly under lantern light. You probably won't survive the temptation to trace every stitch with your fingers, but you resist because even a casual tug could unravel hours of painstaking work. Patterns are not mere decoration here. Each symbol carries meaning, a silent language woven into the very fabric of the court. Cranes and phoenixes dominate many designs, representing longevity and prosperity, while clouds and mountains speak to balance, endurance, and the ephemeral nature of life. Fringe accounts suggest some patterns included tiny, almost invisible motifs, like hidden initials or miniature talismans sewn into seams, meant only to be recognized by the intended sleeper. Historians still argue whether these subtle symbols were purely ceremonial or intended to convey messages across courtly networks. Scholars still argue whether these exotic methods were truly practical or simply performed to impress the king, a kind of silent competition among workshops. You trudge along the line of apprentices, noticing how each applies a slightly different technique. Some hold the silk taut with wooden hoops, guiding their needles with almost hypnotic precision. Others use tiny tools to flatten knots, ensuring the embroidery remains smooth against the delicate fillings. Fringe tales whisper that certain masters could judge an apprentice's skill in a single glance at a motif, spotting misaligned stitches or uneven spacing instantly. Scholars still debate whether these judgments were aesthetic, symbolic, or partly pedagogical. Patterns are often seasonal, reflecting court festivals or ceremonies. Spring motifs include peonies and cherry blossoms, signaling renewal and beauty, while winter designs favor pines and plum blossoms, emphasizing resilience and quiet elegance. You trudge past a partially finished pillow, noting how the subtle curves and flourishes mirror nature's rhythm, as if the artisan has internalized the cycle of the seasons in every stitch. Fringe sources suggest that some masters even whispered to the silk during embroidery, believing that gentle words encouraged harmony in the final piece. Symbols also encoded social hierarchy. Certain patterns were reserved for the king or queen, while others could be used by princes, concubines, or high-ranking officials. Even the choice of thread, gold for royalty, silver for close court members, muted pastels for lower ranks, communicated status silently. Historians still argue whether this visual code was widely understood among palace residents or primarily observed by the artisans themselves. You trudge over to a pillow where the embroidery incorporates subtle geometric shapes, almost imperceptible spirals, diamonds, and triangles. Fringe accounts claim these designs were believed to influence the sleeper's dreams, encouraging harmony and balance. Scholars debate whether such intentions reflect genuine ritual practice or imaginative reinterpretation by later generations. Regardless, the patterns lend the pillow a meditative quality, as if the act of stitching itself transmits calm to the finished object. Some motifs were highly personal. Fringe tales suggest that master artisans sometimes embedded hidden charms or symbols representing specific family members, events, or wishes for longevity. You trudge closer and imagine the tiny needles piercing silk again and again, forming shapes that are both functional and narrative. Historians still argue whether such personalization was widespread or limited to exceptionally favored commissions. You notice that embroidery is not purely visual. The texture, tension, and layering of threads affect both the appearance and feel of the pillow. The act of running a hand across a finished cushion reveals subtle ridges and valleys, almost like a tactile map of artistry. Fringe anecdotes claim that certain textures were thought to soothe the neck and shoulders in a specific way, blending aesthetics with practical ergonomics. Scholars debate whether these claims had empirical grounding or were more symbolic than functional.